Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. I may have said this before, listeners, and if so, you'll forgive me for saying it again. But one of the things I am most proud of in relation to this podcast is the fact that week after week, I get the privilege of not discovering, but spotlighting Australian authors. And this week is no different. I had the pleasure recently of reading a new novel from Sydney-based author Tessa Lunney. Tessa is the author of two novels amongst a swag of short fiction and poetry. Her first novel was called April in Paris 1921, an historical crime novel and the first in the Kiki Button mysteries, which follows, as its subtitle suggests, glamorous Australian gossip columnist Kiki Button living in Paris in 1921. The second novel, entitled Autumn Leaves 1922, was released by Pegasus Books and picks up Kiki's story in Paris in 1922 after a year spent back home in Australia. It's a novel that does much to capture post-war sentiment in Europe, a time where people were still nursing trauma and displacement following the end of World War I, but also fearing the winds of change in the form of fascism and communism. A complex tale with a colourful, vibrant cast of characters, both real and imagined. It's the Great Gatsby meets Phrynne Fisher, if I might be so bold. So I'm delighted to welcome Tessa to the podcast today. Hi, Tessa.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Tessa, can you tell me where the inspiration for these novels came from?
Yes, of course. Well, it's because I want to live in 1920s Paris myself. And I read a lot of books about 1920s Paris, history books and fiction books and crime books and general interwar books, 1920s London, 1930s London. But I stopped wanting to be a fly on the wall of the histories looking in at Picasso sipping his pastis or Hemingway, at the feet of Gertrude Stein. I wanted to be there. And I already had a PhD in creative writing at this point. And I thought, well, Tessa, if you want to be there, you should just write the book and then you can be there. So that's how it started. I'd been reading about 1920s Paris for a long time, since I first read a book called Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson. Mm-hmm. So she's the granddaughter of Vanessa Bell, the artist Vanessa Bell, and the grandniece of writer Virginia Woolf. And Among the Bohemians is a book that looks at that Bloomsbury set at that time, but not their art, but their life, how they dressed, how they partied, what they wore. And it came to me just when I was thinking I wanted to write as more than just a hobby, as more than just a diary. Yeah, and that set me on a path of adoring the 1920s, which grew and grew and grew, and now is two books.
You've really captured that epoch so well and so beautifully in your writing. So Kiki is a headstrong, independent, single woman who is desired by many, intent on living a life both physically and metaphorically far from the one expected of her back in Australia. So I wanted to ask you, Tessa, is she inspired by a real life character?
Not one real life character. She's inspired by the fabulous, intrepid, modern and modernist women who headed to 1920s Paris at that time. So women like Nancy Cunard, like Lee Miller, like Sylvia Beach, like Kiki de Montparnasse, like a lot of the women that I put in the book, Emin David. So there are, Juno Barnes. The list really does go on and on. If you were desperate to be a writer or an artist at that time, Paris was the place to be. And if you could afford it, you took a boat and you went there and you stayed. A lot of Australians went to London first, or stayed in London if they'd been there during the war and then headed to Paris. But yeah, she's inspired by those people, those real life people.
Okay, so before we go any further, for the benefit of those who haven't read this lovely book, can you tell me more about the story?
Sure. So this is Autumn Leaves 1922. This is the second of the Kiki Button mysteries. Kiki has been living in Paris for about 6 months, having returned there after she'd been home in Australia after the war. She'd been a nurse in a war, come home, decided home was no good, gone back to Paris. But then her mother had suddenly died and she'd had to go home, and the grieving as well as the death duties took her away from Paris for a long time. It was very difficult for her. And now in Autumn Leaves, she's back trying to pick up the threads of her old life in Paris, her old friends, but also her old work as a gossip columnist. And she's contacted by her old spy master, Dr. Fox. We meet him in book 1 as well, and he was a fixture during the war, and he has something that he needs her to do. And so she's sucked back into that kind of life of clandestine intelligence work, semi-intelligence work. And so the story follows that, as well as she has another secret. Her mother was not the person that she thought her mother was at all. Her mother had been a very different person to Kiki than she had to the rest of the world, particularly to the people she knew in Paris. So Kiki has a mission to find out who her mother really was.
Through the narrative of this book, we certainly are given glimpses of a young, headstrong Kiki, one who pushed boundaries and confounded her father in many ways. But I wondered how much of Kiki in 1922 is a product of the war? And for that matter, how much are any of the characters that we meet products of the war?
I think to a great extent. For Kiki, the way I imagine it is that after living, she had all the rebellious tendencies, shall we say, but she signed on to be a nurse during the war, and suddenly she had to be very independent, and she had nobody to look after her, and she had to do it all herself. And I remember when I was 16 and I went on exchange to Germany, and I was suddenly independent, and it was dizzying. It was wonderful. I felt really free, even though I had to be completely responsible for myself and there was a lot to do. And I think if you'd been expected to live in a tiny box and been taught to live in a tiny box, and then suddenly that box was exploded, even if you were in uniform, even if you had a lot of work to do, it would be magnificent. And seeing so much death and destruction, I think a lot of Kiki and a lot of her friends and a lot of the people at that time wanted to live a different kind of life. They didn't want it to go back to the way it was before. They wanted to be free, to make the life that they had always dreamed of. And for a lot of people in Europe, especially when there were so many revolutions, they couldn't go back to the way things were before. Politically, it wasn't possible. Their country, or particularly their empire, no longer existed. And then people, sort of women, middle-class women in England who had expected to get married, there was no one to marry of their class. A lot of them had died, and so they were forced to make a different kind of life. And the combination of being forced to live a different kind of life and suddenly needing to, and having the independence and the personal skills to do it, I think the war made a huge difference.
So as mentioned earlier, and you've just touched on this a little bit now just in your answer, you've captured that interwar sentiment of Europe so vividly in this book. And in her role as a gossip columnist, Kiki moved through the expat community and upper echelons of Parisian society easily, one characterised by a great deal of excess, which I found to be quite a marked contrast to the general war weariness and poverty that seemed barely concealed in many pockets, I thought. So I wondered if you could tell me about that and what research you did to recreate that world on the page.
Thank you. I'm glad it's very vivid. What research did I do? I did a lot of research, and I continue to do a lot of research, a lot of reading of the war period and just before, and then of course the interwar period. The period just before the war, which we call the Edwardian period, was characterized by excess in the aristocracy and then the upper middle classes, but the working classes, who were the bulk of the population, could live in absolutely dreadful, grim, horrendous poverty, to the point where men were not well enough or even tall enough to be enlisted. They were just too small and weak and ill because they'd never had enough food. And so some of that was broken by the war, but of course a lot of that still hung around. You can't completely change everything, even though the communists did try very hard. You can't completely change everything overnight. So you still have aristocrats living as though they're part of a 300-year or 1,000-year reign. And you still have working class people who don't have enough money. They're just not being paid enough. They don't have enough conditions. And the 1920s were part of that time of enormous change. So I guess I just kept reading about what people were doing. And some of it was extraordinary and unbelievable, like what happened to Russian aristocrats through the Russian Revolution and then through the Civil War and afterwards. And some of it was all too believable, unfortunately, such as the housing that people went back to live in London after the war.
I mean, as a writer, I really appreciated you being able to create that scene and that image in my mind of the threadbare cuffs of Tom's suit, for example, the child in the Gare du Nord who didn't have boots, was just wearing clogs. And yet on the other extreme, Kiki is partying with people like Chanel and Nancy Cunard. And it was a world of such extremes, but you managed to paint that so vividly with often the smallest of details, which I found quite fascinating from a writer's perspective.
Thank you. Well, I think they did live cheek by jowl, especially in those big cities like Paris and London, where everybody's there doing everything that they possibly can. And sometimes that means you've got silk slippers and clogs next to each other on the pavement.
Indeed. Now, Dr. Fox was both an enigmatic and frightening character, I have to say. What was the inspiration for him?
What was the inspiration for him? That I don't know. He did come out of my subconscious. Perhaps when I was writing the first book, it was the US election between Clinton and Trump. So there was a lot of talk on the airwaves about toxic masculinity, about patriarchy, how that ties into politics, and how that ties into politics, particularly far right versus left politics. And all that was going on as I was writing the first book, where I was also pregnant and breastfeeding. So I felt very exposed to these conversations. But he's also a type of character we meet often. He's a Mr. Rochester as well as a Svengali. He's both sinister but also portrayed as romantic. But it's interesting, it's difficult. Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement was also going on at this time. So all these kind of ideas came together. And I had been asking a question of myself a lot, I guess, which is, how does one recover from a situation where you have been manipulated or abused, even if the abuse wasn't physical or sexual, but emotional, financial? If you're in a situation where you've been coerced, how do you move out of that? How do you live with it? How do you live with it, especially when it's not acknowledged within society that this is bad, that it's wrong, and that it shouldn't happen? And how do you cope with someone like that within your own life when you can't fully move away? But you can't fully engage. Where's the line, and what's the purpose? So I guess I just put them all together to create Dr. Fox. And certainly in the first book, she never sees him, she only hears him on the phone. So it's almost like he's a manifestation of her fears and desires, especially her aberrant desires, because the one thing that Fox gives her that no one else does is enough intellectual stimulation. And no one else really gives her enough to do, or enough credit for doing what she does well. And she has to convince people that she's skilled enough and smart enough to be able to do anything out of the ordinary. And she's not an artist, so she's not going to sit there and write a book or create a masterpiece or a painting or a sculpture. That's not who she is. So how else does she get enough to do?
She certainly proves herself more than capable of the missions that Dr. Fox sends her way. And in this book, a very high profile mission, I would have to say, in many respects. And we can't, obviously, I don't want to talk about it too much because I don't want to go into spoilers, but, this was a high profile mission and something that she was more than capable of doing on her own, as she showed in the end. She certainly does have what I felt was quite a love-hate relationship with Dr. Fox.
Yes, it is a love-hate relationship. She wants to hate him, but there's something that she can't completely hate him. She can't completely divorce herself from him. And she has her reasons, but she's continually questioning those reasons, especially as her friends question those reasons very loudly and continually.
Absolutely. Okay, so as you mentioned in this book, Kiki too is also on her own mission to learn more about her mother by connecting with the artistic set that her mother moved through whilst living in Paris. And Kiki's investigations reveal that the woman she knew as her mother was not the woman that everybody else knew, and that it was clear that she lived really two distinct lives. And what Kiki discovers about her mother is in many ways a testament to the lack of control that women had over their own destinies, especially when they didn't have money. And Maisie, Kiki's friend, was another example I felt of that. The way that Kiki lived was such a stark contrast to these societal limitations. She smoked too much, she drank too much, she loved as she pleased, and I'm guessing this was deliberate on your part.
Yes. It was one of the markers in the 1920s of being a modern woman, that you would smoke, that you would drink in public, that you would wear makeup, that you would go out without a chaperone, you'd go out without a corset, you'd wear high heels, shorter skirts, ever shorter hair. Yes, so it's very deliberate. And for Kiki, it's very deliberate to be that provocative, to declare herself so profoundly through the drinking and the smoking. But it's also one of those things that happened after the war. People smoked too much. After having smoked through the war, they drank too much, either in celebration because they're still alive, or in commiseration to drown their sorrows, and sometimes not really knowing the difference between the two. So these things combine to make Kiki a very hard partying, heavy smoking modern woman.
But I also felt it showed her vulnerabilities in many ways. I mean, she was clearly a flawed character. I almost just wanted to sit her down and feed her. And I think a lot of people did exactly the same. Her friends around her, there was lots of, observations about her being far too thin for her own good.
Yes, she doesn't take care of herself very well. But that was also obviously deliberate. I've read a lot of Phrynne Fisher, and I love Phrynne Fisher. But after 20 books, one thing that always annoyed me was that she could eat as much as she liked, and she never put on any weight. She could drink as much as she liked, and she never got drunk, and certainly she was never hungover. So I wanted to explore what happens, like a male detective, where they drink a lot and then they're hungover a lot. What happens, to the female body when you neglect it, and why you might neglect it as well. And to also challenge some of the ideas of the endless slenderness of flappers in that androgynous way being perfect, that perhaps it's not so perfect, perhaps it's a product of something else.
So, Tessa, if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
A sense of delight. I guess I want them to just enjoy being in Kiki's world. I wrote it so that I could look at some of the difficult things that had happened in 2020 when I was writing it last year, 2019 and 2020. I could look at them slantways. I could look at them sort of obliquely and talk about them in a very roundabout fashion. So I also hope that this is a book where people can maybe think about some of the difficult things that have happened in the past 2 years without being overburdened by the emotions of our contemporary world.
Tessa, you mentioned before, or I might have mentioned it as well, that you hold a doctorate of creative arts from the University of Western Sydney. And as mentioned, you've published novels, short fiction, poetry, amongst other things. Can you give us a glimpse into your journey towards publication? Was writing always what you wanted to do?
No, I wanted to be an actress. From about 10 until maybe 21, I was absolutely desperate to be an actress. And then at 21, I realized it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen like I wanted it to happen. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but basically it wasn't my sort of thing. It just wasn't quite right for me. And I could only really do it when I really didn't care, not pretending I didn't care. I had to actually not care. I said, Tessa, you cannot have a career where you literally don't care about the outcome. And so I floundered around for a few years, and I'd always written a diary, and I'd been doing English was my major in my bachelor's degree, my Bachelor of Arts. And so I did honors, and I went, oh, these are my people, these book nerds, these are my people. And then I started writing in earnest, and then I got very bored and enrolled in a master's, and the only master's they let me enroll in was creative writing. And then I did I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and that's when I was like, wow, this is it. Okay, this is it. This is everything you love about acting without anything that you hate about acting. And it's all of your book nerd favorite people. This is the place to be. And so then I started really writing in earnest, and I did the masters, and I just wanted to keep writing, but somebody had to pay me. So I did the doctorate in creative writing, feeling very lucky and very privileged to be able to do both of those. The novel that I wrote as part of my doctorate, I sent to an agent, and I was accepted, which made me feel great. It's still to find its champion. That book is not yet published. After a number of rejections, I started writing Kiki Button, and that was accepted almost straight away, which is very strange. It's not what my doctorate was on at all. Although it's sort of obliquely what my doctorate was on, which was war fiction. So I read a lot about World War I and World War II, and naturally the interwar period, because I was looking at silence and memory and language. So there's a bit of that in there. But yeah, that's my path to publication. I'd had small publications. That's my path to publication for a novel. I'd had small publications of short fiction and poetry and reviews since I started my master's, I guess. So I had small things published, but not a big thing published.
Fantastic. So Tessa, what tips would you offer aspiring writers out there who listen to this podcast?
I really only have one tip, and that's just to keep going. Keep going, keep writing, whatever is stopping you from writing, if it's internal or external, work around, work with it, accept the limitations if you have to, and if you don't have to, move them aside. But whatever you do and however you can, just keep going. For some people, this will be fairly straightforward. I feel that was fairly straightforward for me. For some people, they have a lot to push against, and I give those people all my best wishes and support. But keep going.
Thank you so much for that. I take heart from that tip as well. So much appreciated. Okay, so you kind of left readers on a bit of a cliffhanger at the end of this book. So does that mean that you're working on another Kiki Button mystery?
Well, I certainly have an idea for one, and giving myself a little bit of a break. I like to have a little bit of a break between calendar years. I had a bit of a break between 1921 and 1922. So I'm having a bit of a break before I jump into 1923.
Tessa, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
Sure. Firstly, there's my website, tessalunney.com. Secondly, there's my social media pages, Facebook, Tessa Lunney Author, Instagram, you can just Google my name or just search my name, Tessa Lunney, and Twitter as well, Tessa Lunney. And you can find also the links on my website.
Tessa, I wanted to say congratulations on the publication of this fascinating book. I wish you all the best with it, and I look forward to hearing more about the third instalment, whenever that might be. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much, Claudine.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.